Coalition webinar, Federal Workforce Policy Mid-Year Update. I'll turn you over to our Federal Policy Director, Kermit Kaliba, and we can get started.
Okay. Thank you, Sylvia. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our mid-year update on federal workforce and higher education policy. I'm Kermit Kaliba. I'm the Federal Policy Director here at National Skills Coalition. I'm pleased to be joined by our Federal Policy Analyst, Katie Spiker. We're pleased to welcome you to the third in our Summer of Skills webinar series. This is a series of webinars that we're doing over the course of the summer to highlight some key developments in federal and state policy. So we had, earlier this month, we had a webinar on WIOA state plans, an overview of some of the key features of the state plans that were submitted under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act on July 7th. We also had a webinar on the WIOA final rules on July 12th. If you weren't able to catch those webinars, they are available on our website. You can download those and look at the slides. I wanted to also flag for those of you who were on the final rules webinar, we did post an FAQ document in response to some of the questions that we weren't able to get to. So if you're interested, please check those out. So our goal today is to provide a little bit of an overview of some of the key federal policy conversations that are happening here in Washington. We did a webinar back in February where we sort of did a preview of what we expected from the year. So we wanted to give folks a chance to sort of recollect and hear what's been happening here in Washington. There's actually been a fair amount of development, a fair amount of work going on under the surface, but not everything has resulted in final policy, so we wanted to get folks up to speed on where those conversations are and where we expect them to go. We are going to leave a lot of time for Q&A at the back end, so please do enter questions into the question box if anything comes up, or if we don't answer questions as part of the presentation. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so we're gonna dive into this in just a second. We'll cover, these are the areas that we're gonna cover. Katie's gonna talk about the federal, the fiscal year 2017 appropriations process and some of the implications for workforce development and higher education programs. She's also gonna share an update on apprenticeship policy. This is an area that we've seen a lot of activity on in the past year, as folks may know. We want to give a little bit of an update on what's happening there, both on the congressional side and on the administrative side. Then we'll turn and talk about three major areas that have been part of our legislative agenda this year, the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, the Higher Education Act, and then the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. We will talk about, very briefly, we'll touch on some of the highlights of the WIOA regs, but we're not going to, since we just did a webinar on that a couple of weeks ago, we're not going to go into a lot of detail. If you have questions about the WIOA regs, we'll try to answer them, but if not, I would encourage you to go and take a look at the webinar and the FAQ document on our website. Before we jump into the sort of the nuts and bolts of what's been happening, I did want to sort of provide a little bit of framing and context for the situation here in Washington. I think the first thing to sort of flag is I do think that there is still a general consensus around the importance of investing in skills and a belief that that there can be bipartisan agreement around skills investments in higher education and job training. So we went through the reauthorization of WIOA in 2014. That was a very strong bipartisan support, almost unanimous passage in the House and the Senate. And I think that really, you still have a lot of members of Congress and a lot of staff who see that as an example of this is an area where the parties can reach agreement and develop substantive policy. And I think that has carried over into some of the other policy conversations here in Washington, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. At the same time, I think we should acknowledge that it is an election year. For those of you who did not know that, sorry to surprise you. But there is, we are moving into an election cycle. And one of the things that happens as a result of that is that the parties do find themselves in a position where they are seeking to sharpen some of the policy contrast between the parties and their particular vision for moving forward. And so I think it's fair to say that as we've moved forward in the calendar year, this has come up in a number of different policy conversations. And so one of the things we'll try to do as we go through these various issues is try to highlight some of the areas where we see bipartisan consensus, but also some of the areas where we're still seeing divisions between policymakers and some of the ways that we think we can try and move that conversation forward. The other thing I'll just flag, so this is we're calling this a mid-year update, but for purposes of congressional action, we really are kind of almost at the end of the legislative calendar. So Congress adjourned for the conventions on July 15th. They're not coming back until Labor Day. They'll come back for a few weeks in September. And then they leave again in October in advance of the November elections, and they're not really scheduled to come back until after the November elections for some business. So a lot of the policy conversations, there are still a couple of opportunities that we see happening in the September session, but in many cases, what we're going to be talking about are conversations that are likely to carry over into into 2017, into the next administration, and into the next Congress. And so I just want to highlight that. So that doesn't mean that these conversations aren't important that we've been having in 2016, because I think it's been setting the framework for a lot of these conversations. So one of the things we'll want to talk about is how do we keep this message going even through the election cycle and into next year? How do we sustain the momentum that we've built? Okay, so I want to turn things over to Katie, and Katie's going to walk us through some of the key developments in the FY 2017 appropriations process.
Thanks, Kermit. And if I can move on to the next slide. Great. So earlier this summer, both House and Senate passed Labor, Health, and Human Services Education Appropriation, Labor HHS appropriation bills through their full appropriations committee. We did see some differences between the different bills that I'll talk about in a little bit. Notably, the Senate's version of the Labor HHS bill passed with bipartisan support, which means that this may be to the agreement that we'll see at the end of the funding discussion when it comes, rather than the House's version, which is supported only on party lines. As far as the timeline, reiterating what Kermit shared, Congress is on recess now through Labor Day. When they come back, that really leaves only 17 voting days in the House, for example, before the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. And in that short window, it's really unlikely that we'll see House or Senate be able to pass the appropriations bills or even an omnibus in that short period of time. So instead, it really is more likely that we'll see Congress pass either a short-term continuing resolution or a long-term continuing resolution. A short-term CR would defer funding negotiations until the members return after the 2016 elections. And there's been some discussion that even that isn't going to please all members on both sides of the aisle, and so that may be more likely to see a longer-term CR that defers negotiations until the spring, when the new administration and new Congress will be in session. As far as what this means for some of our folks in the field, because the continuing resolution tends to keep funding levels at the same as previous years, either a long-term or a short-term CR would mean that some of the policy changes I'll talk about on the next slide that we saw in the Senate Labor HHS bill may be unlikely. So moving on to the next slide. So as I said, there are some differences between the House and Senate versions that we'll see come together as the funding discussion moves on. I'll also note here that as National Skills Coalition's 2016 policy agenda, we focused really heavily on ensuring that WIOA Title I was funded at authorized levels and that we saw increases to both career and technical education state grants and Title II state grants. So while not all of these numbers were reflected in what we heard from, in what we saw in the Labor HHS bills, there's still a little bit of time for folks to influence your members and also gives us strong leverage as we move forward in the conversations. So as far as the differences between the two bills, the Senate version of the Labor HHS bill included about a 3% decrease in WIOA state formula funds. The largest of these cuts came from WIOA Title I, adult and youth programming. The bill would maintain the 15% state set aside for WIOA formula grants authorized under the law. The House version, by comparison, would fund WIOA state grants at essentially 2016 levels. There's a slight increase for WIOA dislocated worker formula grants, but that's coupled with an even larger cut to the dislocated national reserve. So essentially that would fund WIOA state grants at 2016 levels in the House version. Again, we anticipate that the final FY 2017 funding bill will probably parallel the Senate version, and it seems likely that there may be modest cuts to WIOA formula funding compared to FY 2016 levels. Both the Senate and the House versions of the bill maintain FY 2016 funding for Workforce Data Quality Initiative grants and level funding for migrant and seasonal farm workers and ex-offender activities. Another key difference between the Senate and the House version comes to funding apprenticeship. The Senate version would invest $100 million in apprenticeship, which is up $10 million from the $90 million invested in FY 2016, but the House version didn't include funding for this line item. And we also saw a cut in the Senate version to the Community Services Employment for Older Americas program funding, down to $400 million from FY 2016's $434 million. The House version maintained FY 2016 funding levels for CSAP, however. Moving on to the Department of Education side, both the House and Senate versions of the bill maintained FY 2016 funding levels for Perkins Career and Technical Education state grants and Adult Education and Family Literacy state grants. So again, that's lower than where our National Skills Coalition had encouraged members to be, but it is consistent with 2016 levels. Another key difference between the Senate and the House versions, the Labor HHS bill, is that the Senate version included an expansion of Pell funding to reinvest in year-round Pell, meaning that students could qualify for Pell for their summer courses. The Senate bill increases maximum Pell awards to $5,935, and the year-round Pell recipients would be capped at about 150% of that max. Again, the House version doesn't include a provision for year-round Pell, and in fact, it cuts Pell overall funding by $1.3 billion. At both the subcommittee and the committee markups in the House of the bill, Republican leadership did acknowledge, however, that the Senate's inclusion of year-round Pell indicated that this was an area in which the House and Senate would have to negotiate as they reached a final bicameral agreement. So moving on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of the policy and administration efforts around apprenticeship. In 2016, as I mentioned, Congress included $90 million in funding that supported the expansion of apprenticeship. This funding, over the past year, the administration has used this funding to support states' grants, both accelerator and expansion grants that help states with the planning and innovative practices to expand apprenticeship. Funds have also been spent and will continue to be spent on contracts to help support national industry partners who serve as intermediaries, and on contracts to support national equity partners to ensure diversity of the apprenticeship pipeline. And as folks on the call are probably familiar with, the administration has really been a champion of apprenticeship for the past couple of years, starting with $175 million in American Apprenticeship Initiative grants. The administration launched the Registered Apprenticeship College Consortium, which links apprentices' work with community college or college credit. And then again, in the President's FY 2017 budget request, he requested $2 billion for an apprenticeship training fund. While that $2 billion fund hasn't been funded, Congress has also been working on expanding apprenticeship. In addition to just the funding being negotiated between the House and Senate versions of the Labor HHS bill, Senators Murray and Hatch introduced the Effective Apprenticeships to Rebuild National Skills Act, or the EARNS Act, which would legislate and how these investments would be used to expand apprenticeship. Specifically, the EARNS Act authorized $75 million in federal funding, or would authorize $75 million in federal funding, that would be focused on increasing opportunities for both apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programming through competitive grants. And it would also authorize $5 million to support the expansion of the Registered Apprenticeship College Consortium that the administration launched. And finally, it would authorize $20 million for subsidies of up to $25,000 per employer to be paid to sponsors or employers who are developing or expanding new apprenticeship programs. So as you can see, both Congress and the administration have been active on apprenticeship. And I will turn it back over to Kermit now.
Okay, thank you, Katie. And can we go to the next slide? All right. So obviously a lot going on with the appropriations process and a lot of interesting activity in the apprenticeship space, and we're going to continue to monitor that and weigh in with policymakers over the course of the remainder of the year to keep that momentum going. I want to turn now to the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. As folks on the call may know, the Perkins Act is the nation's primary funding vehicle for career and technical education programs at the secondary and the post-secondary level. This is a law that we have been paying, the National Skills Coalition has been focusing on, because we see high-quality investments in career and technical education at both the secondary and the post-secondary level as a critical component of our broader effort to invest in skills and make sure that workers have the credentials they need in order to succeed in the labor market, and businesses can find the workers that they need in order to be successful, particularly at the middle skill level. We've been paying there's also, a number of the policy changes under WIOA, under WIOA, relating to state planning, career pathways, sector partnerships, generally encourage or even in some cases require the participation of career and technical education providers, institutions of higher education. And so one of the things that we've been particularly focusing on is encouraging Congress, as they look at the Perkins Act, to think about strengthening alignment between Perkins and the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, aligning the planning requirements. Both laws have planning requirements, so making sure that Perkins plans are aligned with a state's vision and strategy as set forth under WIOA. We've been advocating for stronger alignment between outcomes metrics for Perkins-funded programs. As folks know, many Perkins-funded programs are also programs that are on a state's eligible training provider list under WIOA. So one of the things we want to encourage is greater alignment of outcome measures so that providers are not having to report two separate sets of outcome requirements. We've been encouraging expanded access to work-based learning opportunities for CTE students, making sure that students who are participating in these programs have the ability to actually go onto a work site or work with employers to get the kind of real hands-on work experience that can be helpful in transitioning into the labor market. And we've also called for significantly increasing funding levels for Perkins. Perkins is being funded at about 25% less than what it was 10 years ago, and so we really want to see increased funding for Perkins at a level that is consistent with the need in today's labor market, particularly as the economy is improving. So, at the start of the year, it wasn't, start of last year, it wasn't clear whether or not the Perkins Act would really be a high priority. There was I think the expectation was that Congress would be tackling the Higher Education Act and that Perkins would probably fall into 2017 or beyond. But as we'll talk about in a second, the Higher Education Act reauthorization process is sort of stalled out, and as a result, that created a set of opportunities for lawmakers to take another look at Perkins. And we actually saw some fairly substantial movement just earlier this month. The House Education and Workforce Committee has a bill called the Strengthening Career and Technical Education Act Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act. This is a bipartisan bill that was developed by Chairman Klein and Ranking Member Bobby Scott from the Education and Workforce Committee. Glenn Thompson and others on the House have contributed to this piece of legislation. It's a comprehensive reauthorization bill that would reauthorize the Perkins program for 6 years into fiscal year 2022. And we're pretty excited about the bill. It makes a number of the changes that we had recommended to both the House and the Senate back in October when we released our Perkins recommendations. It does support stronger alignment between Perkins and WIOA state plans. So Perkins plans have to describe how they fit within the broader state workforce strategy for increasing skills in the state. It does include, at least at the post-secondary level, it does seek to align some of the performance outcomes with the common indicators under WIOA. So the law would require performance reporting on employment in the second quarter after completion of a program. It would include an earnings measure. It includes a measure of credential attainment. So all relatively consistent with the performance indicators under WIOA for the core programs. So we think that's moving in the right direction. They didn't go quite as far as we'd hoped, but in terms of making sure that there was a measure of effectiveness in serving employers, but we do think that this is a step in the right direction. The House bill also adopts a number of the key definitions and concepts from WIOA. So adopts the definition of industry or sector partnerships, adopts the definition of career pathways, recognized post-secondary credentials, and other key definitions. I think what's important about that is that that means that different stakeholders within the system will be using common terms and common definitions, and we think that makes it a lot easier for stakeholders at the state and the local level to work together more effectively. There's a small amount of funding, a very small amount of funding for innovation grants. It works out to about $8 million a year or so for coalitions of training providers, Perkins-funded training providers, industry, and other stakeholders to implement innovative workforce development strategies. The bill would also, as I say, it reauthorizes Perkins for 6 years. It would provide authorized funding levels for FY17 through FY22 with modest increases of about 1.5% a year. So it's not a perfect bill. There are some we submitted recommendations when that committee was marking up the bill, encouraging them to strengthen investments in overall funding for Perkins. We certainly called on them to, if they were going to invest in innovation grants, we called on them to increase that funding. We also encouraged them to go further in terms of adopting the common indicators, particularly around effectiveness in serving employers. And we strongly encourage them to focus more in the bill on work-based learning strategies. But I think overall, we think that the bill is a step in the right direction. It's certainly moving to greater alignment between career and technical education programs, particularly at the post-secondary level, and other federal and state programs investing in skills, and we think that that's the right direction to go. So I mentioned the committee had introduced the bill. It was approved in early July on a unanimous basis. So I think the vote was 37-0 in the committee. So it shows that there was very strong bipartisan support for this bill. On the Senate side, there have been ongoing bipartisan negotiations in the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, but led by Senator Enzi of Wyoming and Senator Casey from Pennsylvania. They've been working in collaboration with Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Murray. We have not seen a draft bill out of the Senate, and so in terms of next steps, our expectation is that the House the full House is likely to vote on the House version of the Perkins bill probably in early September is what we're hearing. And then the question is going to be whether or not the Senate will take action, either taking up the House bill or seeking to introduce their own bill and then moving towards conference negotiations. I think that realistically, if there's the odds of being able to move this through by the end of the year are probably about 50-50, depending on how interested the Senate is in trying to move some of the stuff that they've been negotiating on. So we're going to continue to monitor. I think one of the things that, from an advocacy perspective, I think it's useful to weigh in with policymakers and let them know, first, just support their efforts to update the Perkins Act to bring it in line with some of the other policy investments, some of the other skills investments we're making through at the federal level, but also weighing in to make sure that they understand the importance of continuing to invest in high-quality training, work-based learning, and other strategies that we know are effective. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the Higher Education Act. And I mentioned when I started talking about Perkins, we had very high hopes for the Higher Education Act in this session. Back at the beginning of last year, back at the beginning of 2015. Senator Lamar Alexander, who's the chair of the Senate Health Committee, had made clear that HEA reauthorization was his #1 priority. He's a former Secretary of Education and had made it has always taken a strong interest in higher education policy. I think really was interested in trying to move something forward. And the Senate had I think a total of 7 hearings on higher education reauthorization in 2015. The senator and committee staff released a set of white papers outlining some of their core ideas, and so we had relatively strong expectations around HEA reauthorization moving, at least on the Senate side. Unfortunately, I think it's safe to say that the HEA reauthorization has sort of stalled out at this point, and I think there's a couple of reasons a couple of contributing factors that we've been monitoring. The first thing is, and I mentioned it, and I have a bullet here on this slide, is the ongoing debate around the Every Student Succeeds Act. The Every Student Succeeds Act was a piece of legislation that folks may know about that reauthorized or replaced the No Child Left Behind law. It's our K-12 legislation. There has been, an ongoing debate on Capitol Hill between congressional Republicans and particularly the Department of Education around the regulatory process. One of the key features of ESSA when it was passed was this idea of reducing the federal role in oversight and administration of K-12 programs through K-12 investments, and I think there continues to be there's a perception, at least on the Hill, that the administration is overstepping their bounds with their regulations to implement ESSA. And while that doesn't necessarily impact higher ed directly, what it has meant is that we've seen no fewer than 5 hearings this past year over ESSA regulatory implementation. So it's taking up, I think, a lot of the bandwidth on the committee, and it's sort of, when you think about all the other priorities that the committee has, it's the Health, Education, and Labor Pension Committee, so they've also been looking at Zika funding and opioid legislation. There just hasn't been a whole lot of time to focus on higher education. So it has sort of, I think it's safe to say that it's sort of, there just hasn't been time to get to consensus on a lot of the key points. I think the other big thing that's been happening with higher ed is I think there's increasingly a sense that there isn't as much consensus around higher ed policy between the parties as had been thought at the beginning of last year. We've seen the administration, for example, announce their America's College Promise initiative back in 2015, calling for 2 years of guaranteed college education for either for academic or occupational training. And I think one of the things that we've seen is this is, student debt and student debt issues and and college access issues have emerged as sort of a political issue in certainly in the presidential campaign. We're seeing this sort of emerge as an issue where I think both parties see opportunities to outline very different visions for what higher education will look like moving forward. And so I think that has sort of heightened some of the contrast between the varying visions for what higher education is going to look like. And so we have not seen as much forward progress on the Senate side as we would have hoped. I will say, so that on the House side, we did see a couple of small bills that were passed earlier this month. So there was a bill, a bipartisan bill, on simplifying the FAFSA, the federal application for student aid, that included, amongst other things, the ability for students to use prior income data, tax data in determining their student aid eligibility. That's something that we had called for in our Higher Education Act reauthorization recommendations. We also saw there's a reporting bill, a data reporting bill sponsored by Congresswoman Fox from North Carolina, which would increase data reporting for college programs, or for colleges looking at occupational outcomes. It's not as strong as we would like, but it is moving in the right direction. We don't have any real expectation that these House-passed bills will be taken up by the Senate. We think that at this point the higher education conversation is likely to roll into next year, but I did want to at least flag that there has been a little bit of activity on the House side. The one other big sort of development, I think, to just flag on the higher education front is, while Congress hasn't really been able to move anything forward, the administration has sort of has been moving forward with the idea of the America's College Promise proposal. So folks may remember the president announced the America's College Promise back in 2015, and while it didn't gain any traction in Congress last year, it was included again in the president's FY17 budget proposal, and then a couple of months ago, the administration announced that they were going to be releasing $100 million as part of what's called their America's Promise Grant program, which will be investing in partnerships between community colleges, higher institutions of higher education, employers in targeted sectors, and other stakeholders, with the idea of expanding access to high-quality job training programs in targeted industries, targeted sectors. The grant itself. It's funded through the H-1B grant program. So this is really not something that we that's part of statute. So this is kind of the downside of this is that it's a one-time grant opportunity. The advantage of it is that overall we think the grant program is focusing on a lot of things that we would like to see expanded. So not just focusing on industry partnerships, but specifically focusing on strategies like career pathways, upskilling low-skilled incumbent workers, other approaches to work-based learning like registered apprenticeship and internship and externship. There's a real strong focus on trying to move some of these key best practices that we know are effective for serving working adults and low-income workers. So we think it's a step in the right direction, and hopefully a model for higher education conversations moving forward. It's also one of the things that's important about these America's Promise grants is that they focus on making these programs tuition-free for students, including working adults. And so I think that's an idea that has gained more traction in the policy and political conversations in Washington and as part of the presidential campaign. And so I think one of the things that we'll be monitoring is the extent to which we can start to see a move towards better financial aid for working adults. Folks who are familiar with our work know that we have been, one of the things that we have been working on as part of HEA reauthorization is expanding access to short-term occupational training for the Pell Grant program and student and other financial aid programs. We think that this is an important priority, and we're going to continue to advocate for that moving forward. We also have been pushing for greater transparency and data for post-secondary programs, and we'll continue to advocate for that as we move forward and as we move into 2017. Okay, can we move to the next slide? Okay. So the last sort of substantive area that I want to talk about is TANF reauthorization. This is an area where we've been spending a lot of time. I think folks may have seen, if you're on our mailing list, you may have seen that we just released a set of TANF reauthorization recommendations last week. So we thought it might be useful to talk a little bit about what's been happening with TANF over the past 2 years and where we see it headed. So, TANF has not actually been reauthorized in a major way since 2005. Congress has been reauthorizing it more or less on an annual basis since 2005. So definitely overdue for congressional updates. I think it has historically been seen as a program where there isn't a lot of room for bipartisan agreement. So since the law was originally passed back in 1996, I think that it's been seen as an area where the parties don't see eye to eye on how to move things forward. We have been, along with a number of other organizations here in Washington, we have been strongly advocating taking another look at TANF and particularly rethinking some of the provisions that restrict access to education and training and some of the ways in which we measure outcomes and success under TANF. One of the things we know about TANF recipients is that a very substantial majority of TANF recipients that are work eligible lack training beyond the high school level. Many of them don't even have a high school diploma or equivalency, and so they aren't really able to take advantage in many cases of middle skill job opportunities when they come online, and they're not well equipped to often to move into higher level training. And TANF also has a number of policy restrictions on access to education and training because of the sort of the work first mentality that was baked into the law back in 1996. We've been particularly given the changed role of TANF under WIOA because TANF is now a mandatory partner in the one-stop system, and it's a potential combined plan partner program for state planning purposes. We've really been encouraging Congress to rethink the provisions that restrict access to education and training for TANF recipients and really focus on investing more in high-quality education and training and work supports for TANF recipients so that they can transition off of public assistance and into family-supporting jobs. So, so we actually did have a discussion draft that was released by the House Ways and Means Committee last summer. It was actually just about a year ago, and I think that it was a bill that we were a little bit surprised to see. It was actually in many ways a very strong bill on some of the key issues that we have been advocating for in the past. So it was a bill that would have eliminated some of the key restrictions on education and training, would have reduced, for example, would have gotten rid of the distinction between what are called core activities and non-core activities. So not to get overly technical, but there are certain education and training activities that don't count towards state work requirements unless people have participated in at least 20 hours of some other qualifying activity. We've encouraged in the past getting rid of that distinction to make sure that people are not that training and education activities are not disfavored under TANF. So it would have made changes there. It would have called for greater focus on employment outcomes and earnings outcomes as opposed to just measuring how many hours of participation TANF recipients had in work activities. Also would have strengthened alignment between the TANF planning process and WIOA planning. So it was overall, we didn't think it was a perfect bill. It didn't get rid of the work requirements, the hour requirements under TANF, but it was overall a very strong, a step in the right direction as a discussion draft. There was a lot of pushback in Washington, particularly from national groups that were concerned that the Ways and Means discussion draft would have undercut some of the some of the sort of the core work requirements and the focus on work under TANF. And so ultimately the committee did not end up marking up that discussion draft. Instead, they earlier this year they marked up a couple of smaller bills, including one bill that would take $100 million out of the TANF contingency fund and put it towards social impact programming. So social impact programs. In the end, that was the only bill, the only TANF-related bill that ended up passing the House. Passed the House earlier, I think in June, and it included a one-year extension of TANF. So, you know, from this very large sort of bold rethinking of TANF, we saw the House sort of filter down to this one-year extension and shifting not an insignificant amount of money, $100 million, but shifting, but again shifting some existing funding from the contingency fund over to social improvement, social impact programming. So that was disappointing, but I think it does create the stage for, as we move, particularly as we head into 2017, it does create the stage for further conversations. And we do think that there will be a broader policy conversation here in Washington around welfare reform, both including TANF, but also thinking more broadly. So folks may be aware the House Speaker Paul Ryan announced earlier this year a set of task forces which were composed of multiple committees working on a range of different issues, including health care and tax reform. They did have they did create a task force that was focused on welfare reform, and they issued a report in June. And it took a very broad sort of definition of the idea of welfare, included a range of different means-tested programs, including TANF and SNAP and Medicaid and other programs, and called for a range of changes, including extending some of the work requirements or some of the concepts of the TANF work requirements into other programs like SNAP and into Medicaid and others. So, so I think that, you know, part of the reason why Speaker Ryan wanted to have these task forces is that this is part of the broader legislative agenda that we expect the House to be, regardless of the outcome in November. We expect the House to be trying to move this, assuming that the Republicans keep control of the House. We expect that this sort of agenda is going to be driving the conversation. I think that there will be an ongoing policy conversation around TANF and welfare reform more broadly, and so it's going to be important for us as advocates to continue to weigh in with policymakers on this issue, making sure that you know that if we're having a conversation around expanding work requirements for means-tested programs for low-income individuals, that this is not done in a way that would impact eligibility for benefits. We don't want to lose access to the safety net features of these core programs, because they are an important part of making sure that people can weather the storm in periods of economic downturn. But also thinking about more broadly about you know, if we're thinking about if the House or if congressional leaders are looking at expanding work requirements, looking at how do we make sure that those work activities lead to family supporting jobs. So making sure that we're investing in education and training activities, making sure that we're investing in work supports and income supports and supportive services to make sure that individuals have the skills and the credentials they need to transition into family supporting employment, and also making sure that they have the supports to sustain them both as they enter employment, but also as they continue along a career pathway. We've had a lot of good policy advancements over the past couple of years in key areas like sector partnerships and career pathways. We want to build on that model as we think about TANF reauthorization and other programs. One thing I'll flag very quickly is, so on the Senate side, there was a piece of legislation called the Empower Act that was introduced. It was a bipartisan bill that was introduced by Senator King from Maine, Senator Ayotte from New Hampshire, Senator Brown from Ohio, and Senator Capito from West Virginia. This is a piece of legislation that we don't expect to be taken up by the Senate this year, but does include a lot of NSC's policy recommendations, particularly around eliminating the restrictions on education and training. So that's a piece of legislation that we'll continue to monitor. We think that's a good framework for continuing this the discussion as we move forward into 2017. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie to close us out, talking about the WIOA final rules very briefly.
Thanks, Kermit. So as Kermit mentioned earlier in the webinar today, National Skills Coalition hosted a webinar earlier this month covering some of the changes in the final regulations. So I won't delve too deeply into the content, but I will note that at the end of June, on June 30th, the departments issued final regulations for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. All thousands of pages of these regulations reflect input from stakeholders over the past year. There are some key updates from the notice of proposed rulemaking language. We saw increased and strengthened language around the delivery of work experience for Title I youth programming, further information about priority of service, and also one important change was that the final regs will now require states to describe methods used for joint planning and coordination across the core programs and required partners, as one of the goals of the Workforce and Innovation and Opportunity Act was to increase this planning and coordination. The final rules declined to include additional regulatory language around a variety of other topics, but they did include commitments from the departments to issue additional guidance. So we'll see guidance and technical assistance that'll help states with a number of aspects of the new law, like implementing career pathways and industry and sector partnerships. We also anticipate technical assistance around developing parameters for measuring effectiveness of engaging with employers and mechanisms to incorporate co-enrollment between youth and adult services in Title I and Title II. If you're interested in more detail, you can watch our webinar, which is on the website. Excuse me, and we also released a FAQ document, which is up on the website now. So with that, we can turn over to questions if we have folks who have submitted questions into the question box. Kermit, I'll start with one for you.
Okay.
So it sounds like folks are interested in how they can further engage in the conversation around Perkins, both as a funding conversation and also as we look to reauthorize the bill. Is there anything in particular that would be helpful for stakeholders to contribute, and how should they do so, and what's the timeline?
Sure. So as I say, as we talked about, Perkins is still an active conversation on the Hill. The House is, as we said, the House is likely to take up their version of the bill in September. And as I said, we don't quite know what the Senate process is going to be. We're hopeful that they will at least release, if they don't decide to move something forward on the floor, we hope they'll at least release their discussion draft so that stakeholders have an opportunity to evaluate both the House and the Senate version as we head into 2017. I think that, from an advocacy perspective, the key messages that we want to get across around Perkins are we want to make sure that that lawmakers are aware that we do want to see Perkins reauthorized, and we do want to see it updated for the 21st century economy. We know that as the economy is picking up, we have more employers who are concerned about addressing skill shortages, particularly for middle-skilled jobs that require more than a high school diploma, but less than a 4-year college degree, and that's really what Perkins-funded programs are supposed to be driving towards. So letting policymakers know that Perkins is a priority and that you do want to see action on it, I think that's probably the most important message to be getting to policymakers is that we do want to see the bill updated and modernized and reauthorized. I think the other sort of area that one key message point is encouraging policymakers to look at funding levels for Perkins. And I mentioned one of the concerns that we have about the Perkins funding levels that were outlined in the House bill is even in FY22, so at the end of the bill's authorization cycle, we would still be, when you adjust for inflation, we would still be funding in FY22 at a lower level than the Perkins State Formula Program was funded back in 2006 when the bill was last reauthorized. And I think that, you know, we recognize that there are always fiscal challenges. There are a lot of competing priorities. But I think sending the message that we want Congress to make sure that they are making adequate investments in all of workforce programs, including the WEO programs, but in the Perkins conversation, making sure that we're increasing funding for Perkins state grants at least to historic funding levels of where we were 10 years ago. We think that that's given the change in the labor market, that's an important direction to push policymakers, make them aware of the importance of making sure there's funding available. I think we have also we have been encouraging Congress as part of our advocacy efforts to really focus on dedicated funding for partnerships between, particularly between community colleges and technical colleges, employers, and other stakeholders as part of an industry or sector partnership model. There was a piece of legislation called the Community College to Career Fund Act, which was introduced by Senator Franken on the Senate side, Congresswoman Duckworth on the House side, that would have created funding for these kinds of partnerships between community and technical colleges and other stakeholders. We think it's really important, in addition to the formula funding, we think it's also important for advocates to be weighing in on this particular function, funding those kinds of partnerships, high-quality partnerships, so that we can expand the availability of high-quality training in targeted industries. I think that we have materials on our website. We have our Perkins recommendations. We also have on our website, we have the comments that we submitted to the House committee when they were marking up the bill. Folks should feel free to use our materials as they see fit. And if you have specific questions, we are always happy to try and answer those questions by email or by phone. But those are sort of kind of the key priorities that we still think are important as part of the Perkins reauthorization process. So Katie, I'm going to ask you a question. We have a question talking about I mentioned the America's Promise grants that were announced by the administration, and they were looking for examples of targeted industry. We had a question about target industries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So the American College or the American Promise grants were funded by H-1B funds, which target middle to high skill industries, in-demand industries like IT, healthcare, advanced manufacturing. This has been a source of funding for many of the grant programs that we've seen come out of the administration. The American Apprenticeship Initiative was also funded with H-1B funds. And so we've seen these kind of target technology-based and in-demand industries being funded under a variety of funding sources, similar to the American Promise grant.
Okay, great.
So it looks like Kermit, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
It looks like we have a couple questions about TANF. I think these may have come in before your comments on where the updates on TANF, but were there any other steps that you think that our partners in the field should know about, any barriers in some of their advocacy they may run into, or any next steps you'd encourage them to take?
Sure. So, I think one of the things that, and I'm looking at the questions, some of the questions we've gotten, I think that somebody raised this really important point about how states are investing their TANF dollars. One of the things that we raised up in our TANF recommendations that we released last week is the really, for all the funding that's available through the TANF State Block Grant, a relatively small percentage of it is going to actually provide services to TANF recipients, particularly in education and work activities. So we estimated, based on the data that we have from the Department of Health and Human Services, that less than 7% of all TANF federal and state combined funds are going towards work activities broadly defined, and less than 1% of TANF dollars are going towards education and training activities. So I think this is really a key message that advocates should be looking at and talking about with their policymakers, with lawmakers, both at the federal level and I think at the state level. Is, we do invest about $32 billion a year combined in federal and state investments in the TANF program, but we know that many of the individuals who are receiving TANF benefits are not able to access education and training, and we're not really investing at the level that we would need to do so to make sure that TANF recipients, low-skilled TANF recipients, have the skills and the credentials they need in order to transition off of employment and into sustainable, off of public assistance and into sustainable employment. So I think this is a really I would encourage folks to take a look at our policy recommendations, but I think this is one of the key questions that we want to be raising with policymakers is, how can we expect folks who are on public assistance to transition off of public benefits and find sustainable family supporting jobs unless we're willing to put the resources into education and training and coordinate with other federal programs. So I think that's a key message that we want to be raising. And I think one of the in addition to just the resource allocation, this point that I raised about the training restrictions right now, states are really measured only on the number of the percentage of individuals who are engaged in work activities, and in many cases states are not allowed to count certain education and training activities, or they're limited in the way that they can count education and training activities under TANF in order to meet those work participation requirements. And so that creates disincentives for states to be creating education and training opportunities for TANF recipients. So I think this is another area to be lifting up with policymakers. We've made some really important strides with WIOA, where we recognize the importance of investing in skills. We understand the importance of making sure that people can get the credentials they need to transition into middle skill jobs. We understand that employers need a skilled workforce in order to be competitive. But we have this whole program where we know that people could benefit from education and training, where employers could be benefiting from a skilled workforce, and we're not making the kinds of investments as a country that we need to be making, and we're actively restricting access to education and training as part of the performance outcomes system. So we really do want to really kind of shape this message around, if we're going to have a conversation around expanding access to jobs for low-skill, low-income individuals, we have to have a serious conversation about the resource allocation and how we create those opportunities. And so if we're going to move towards trying to expand work requirements, it needs to be coupled with investments in education and training to make sure that those work opportunities are good opportunities, that they lead to good jobs, and to make sure that there are supports to help people not only remediate barriers to employment, but to stay in employment and advance throughout their careers. So I think those are the kind of the key messages that we want to be lifting up with policymakers. Okay. All right, so I see that we're pretty much at the end of time. So what I'd like to do is we're going to go ahead and say thanks to everybody for participating in today's webinar. I know there were some folks who submitted questions that we didn't have time to get to. So what we'll try to do is we'll try to respond to folks directly over the next couple of days, and we will also try to put together an FAQ document to respond to some of the questions that we weren't able to get to. If we could go to the next slide. If folks have additional questions on any of these topics, if we didn't get to anything, if we didn't clarify anything, please feel free to shoot us an email. You can see my email and Katie's email there. We're happy to answer any questions on anything. And I do want to just again reinforce we have our policy recommendations on Perkins, on TANF, on the Higher Education Act are available on our website. We also have our funding analysis of the House and the Senate bills available on our website, so I'd encourage you to take a look. And again, thank you to everyone who showed up for today's webinar, and we look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks so much.